Hello everybody and welcome to the South Florida Power BI user group. I hope everyone is well and thank you for making the time to join us here today for another great presentation where we have none other than Melissa Coates. Hello Melissa.
Hi everybody, how you doing?
All right, first of all, thank you very much for making the time and be here with us all. And
Dang.
all right, and you'll be presenting on what you need to know to administer Power BI. So, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure, we're going to do a overview session on the types of things that you want to be thinking about with regard to administration with a primary emphasis on the Power BI service.
All right, great. And thank you very much. So, that is, if you are out there interested about administering Power BI, this is definitely the session for you. So, sit back and you will navigate through an array of vast array of information that will educate you on the topic. Now, can you tell us here, Melissa, where are you located at?
I am in Charlotte, North Carolina, so the east coast of the U.S., if anybody is outside of the U.S.
All right, and folks, you are out there, got the live chat. It's a great opportunity for you to interact with us here. So subscribe, and you'll see on your right side the chat where you can drop your questions during the session, and we will relay that information to Melissa during the presentation. And you also, if you click the bell, you get the reminders, and you'll also be up to date when we have new sessions, future sessions coming up on YouTube. So remember, drop it here. I see a couple people saying Lean from Brazil. Leon. Hello, Leon. I'm also from Brazil, so welcome to the channel. And bem-vindo. All right. So, folks, Melissa, I also know that you have a course. Can you tell us about how, we come here, we learn about the session and some information about administering Power BI, and you have more encompassing courses. Can you tell us about it?
Sure, I've got a course called Power BI Deployment and Governance Workshop, and it is 10 live sessions over 5 weeks. We do the live sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it's going to be at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And we basically just walk through, from a Power BI governance perspective, all of the different things that you would want to consider in order to really get a handle on deploying and governing Power BI effectively, which isn't easy. It's really complicated. And we'll actually touch on a number of those issues just very lightly in this session tonight as well.
Fantastic. So, if this session, would you say is designed more for developers, administrators, and business individuals as well?
Yeah, so it's designed for the person who's been asked to oversee Power BI. And a lot of times that's your IT person, and it's an administrator. But it's also surprisingly a number of people that are in business units, especially if they don't have administrator rights, but they're supposed to be helping their business unit deploy and use Power BI effectively. And they might work with the Center of Excellence, they might work with the administrators, they might work with the security team. And so it can help arm them with information for how to talk to them and how to collaborate really effectively. So one perfect example from the last session was I had a couple of people who had more questions than I expected about security groups in Azure Active Directory. And so they weren't aware, right? Because they're just used to asking for a group, right? And they weren't aware that, oh, depending on the kind of group I ask for, the functionality we can do in Power BI is different, right? So arming people with that kind of information. So those are the two main groups of people that I think would benefit the most.
Absolutely. So it is pivotal for those who are out there engaged in administering Power BI and or doing deployments. So it's a great opportunity to, not only get the skills on the how to do, but also to troubleshoot in the case here if the challenge may arise, with the configuration, and also how to roll out the initiative itself. Sounds like.
For sure, for sure. So the next session starts on April 13th. And as soon as we get into the slides here, I'll have a URL for you so that you can go hunt up info if you're interested.
All right, so it's going to be online, and I see here we have people today from Miami, Florida, the area here, where I'm at, from Canada, Poland, quite well-rounded, in New Jersey, quite well-rounded. Thank you all for being here.
Fantastic.
Yes, and hey, and folks, remember, if you wanna ask questions, drop here on the live chat. You need to be subscribed so you can come in and drop the question. Do not forget to like the video and drop a comment. And without further ado, Melissa, it's all you there.
All right, thank you so much. So just very briefly, I'm self-employed, so small but mighty company of one. My company is called Coates Data Strategies, and really my background is in data warehousing, data platform type of work, but in the last 2 or 3 years, I found myself working pretty much exclusively in helping customers deploy Power BI. So that has become my niche because there's too darn much to focus on in the entire data platform world. I know you all feel it, how fast things change. So in the last year or so, I've really kind of reduced my focus to this area of Power BI governance and administration. In terms of getting started with this session, what I really want to do is 3 main things here. One is why the Power BI administrator role depends on a few things. And so we're going to do an intro session just to get you thinking about a couple of things. We're going to talk about the breadth and scope of responsibilities, and that's the crux of the whole session. It's not a deep dive by any means, but I'm going to give you some things to think about, hopefully. And then I'm going to conclude with, depending on where you're at, here's some next steps that you might consider doing. Here is the flow of our conversation that we're going to take tonight. So we're going to start with a few admin responsibilities. Who should be an admin? That's going to take us into the Power BI service. And then we're going to go into premium and gateways. And then we are going to round out our conversation with a little bit of security and activity monitoring. If you'd like a copy of the slides that you're looking at here today, you can go to my website, and if you go to the presentations page, you will see, I think this is the 2nd or 3rd presentation listed. You'll find the slide download there, and then you're about to see a diagram, and if you'd like to download a copy of that too, that's available on my website as well, just on a different page. And with that, let's go. So here's the diagram that I mentioned a moment ago. And I do not want to review this in depth, but what I do want to do is really convey that Power BI is a very broad set of tools, and it integrates with a lot of other things as well. So if you're new to Power BI, and in the chat, actually, if you're comfortable, tell us, if you're pretty new to Power BI, tell us if you are coming at it from, say, an author perspective as opposed to an IT perspective, that kind of thing. But if you are newer to it, when somebody says Power BI, what I want you to think about is, well, what do they mean? Do they mean the desktop tool, which in this diagram is right here? Do they mean the Power BI service, which is where most commonly is where we deploy content, but not exclusively, right? Do they mean the entire ecosystem? And so the big message here is that it is more than just a reporting tool. So the top things that an administrator needs to know if you're brand new to managing Power BI is A, it can do data acquisition, preparation, modeling, visualizations, right? It's kind of a lighter weight ETL tool, in addition to being able to do visualizations and reports. So sometimes when there's a company that's saying, yeah, we're going to start rolling this out, and they start getting the various teams from IT involved, it's a big aha moment for some teams to say, oh, this is more than just a different kind of SSRS, right? That kind of thing. It stores data in its in-memory engine, and that goes along with it being more than just a reporting tool, but it means that there's a lot of data management considerations. You need to know that visuals can be surfaced and displayed in a whole lot of ways, right? We can use the Power BI service. We can use Teams, or we can use embedded in custom apps and so forth, that sort of thing. We can deploy it in the Power BI service. We can view it in the mobile app or the Windows app. We have integration with Excel. You get the picture. All of this is really just to say that the best Power BI administrator is one that understands what the users are trying to accomplish and is not just a technical resource where, this is just one of 10 different platforms that they're charged with administering. Easier said than done sometimes, I know. Here is a chart that you have probably seen some version of this. I created the very first one of these back in 2016 in a white paper that's now kind of not even, it's defunct now. It's not even readily available out there anymore. But what this is trying to convey and why it's relevant for you as an administrator is that you might have, if we start over here on the right, you might have BI that's going on where your business people are doing everything end to end, right? Not only the data, but the reports. They are taking control of everything, which is possible. Power BI is powerful enough to do that. You might, however, have much more of a centralized system going on where central IT or a BI business intelligence group or a COE, like a center of excellence, anything of that nature, right, might be responsible for everything. And then there's the middle ground, right, where maybe we have some centralized data management happening and the decentralized business officers creating the reports. And Microsoft likes to refer to that as discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. Now, the reason I mention this is because all three are probably happening at once in your company. And in fact, all three could be happening inside of one individual group or department inside your company. And it absolutely affects your administrative responsibilities based on how people are using the system. The other things that affect you from an administrator aspect are, internally things like your data management maturity level. For instance, doing deployments, right? Is there a proper change management process? That kind of thing. And just various data culture aspects. Externally, right? Things like your regulatory requirements, other industry or competitive kind of influences that push your managers to push you to move fast, right? All of that absolutely affects what an administrator really does. So every single one of you that's listening to this, your version of being a Power BI administrator is going to be a little bit different from everybody else due to all these kinds of things. Tell me in the chat, if you would, is Power BI administration formally part of your job role? Or are you kind of what we would refer to as an accidental administrator? Now, the other thing that I kind of want to cover briefly is, well, what is our scope of administration? And here's another thing where it's really fuzzy and it will be different for each one of you. So if we think about it, if we use this example first, and we would say, well, change management and deployment go absolutely together very, very well, but technically they're two different things. Same idea with data governance and administration. Those are two different but very, very related things. So the way I define governance is, the organization's guidance and policies and processes to make sure that we are using data well, right? Little more than that, but we'll keep it simple. And administration is the day-to-day activities that are going to help enact those governance policies. So very, very related. All of these things are hyper related, but for the vast majority of Power BI administrators, most of you are going to be part-time Power BI administrators along with whatever else you're asked to do. And you're also going to be involved with some or even all of these other things. Any interesting comments that we got in the chat yet before I keep going?
Yes, 2 seconds here. Yeah, we have a couple here. I have, Christina Gillook. Thank you, Christina, for your post. Says, that's awesome. And she also says, as a SciTech librarian, Power BI means to me as the whole ecosystem, including DAX.
Ah, yes, indeed it does. Agreed.
Yeah. You have Cosmin, Polly as accidental administrators. Then you have Denise administrating as the formal role.
Nice.
And you have Rick, who takes care of all Power BI tasks and manage all of the data that feeds it.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, Rick got its hands full from end to end.
For sure.
And Kevin is trying to decide where his role fits into this everything here.
Yes, it's tricky sometimes for sure. So let's talk about some of the most common responsibilities that fall under, the Power BI admin. So administering the Power BI service and the tenant settings are the two biggest, and that's where we're going to spend a good bit of time tonight. Managing and creating workspaces is another big one, and we'll talk about that just a little bit as well. Helping manage or at least somewhat support security and possibly even audit and monitor security is usually a common thing that the admin would also get involved with. Now, I tend to classify the Power BI Gateway Administrator as a separate role that could absolutely be done by the same person, but managing your gateways and your data sources certainly is a common item, and we're going to spend some time there. Auditing and monitoring, one of my favorite topics. The big one there is pulling your activity logs and really understanding what's going on in your system. So we're going to cover that towards the end of our presentation. Managing premium capacity, technically that's a separate role, but again, chances are the same Power BI service administrator is going to have some responsibilities there. Helping with deployments, especially if you start getting involved with deployment pipelines, is certainly a factor. How about the desktop software? Now, this is one where we start thinking, well, maybe this falls to the infrastructure team. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on how big your company is usually. So we'll talk about that briefly. Licensing and user management, getting more and more important all the time. Power BI Report Server, which we're not going to touch on tonight time-wise, but if you have that set up as well to deploy content, and usually in the situation where we're talking about it here, a lot or most of the content would go to the Power BI service and certain bits of content would go to Power BI service, or it would be a company that says, I'm not comfortable with the Power BI service yet for whatever reason, we're going to stick with just Power BI report server. So that would be a responsibility as well. And then just integration with other apps, right? Helping make sure everything is configured and working as appropriate. So that's a lot, right? That's a pretty wide scope of responsibilities. And here's the deal. Power BI administrators have direct control over a whole bunch of stuff that directly affect the user experience. People read things online about what you can do with Power BI only to figure out, oh, no, I can't make it work. And so, you know, some people will know who to ask and why, or go to support formally. Others are just going to sigh and move on and say, I can't make it work. I'm going to keep doing my same old thing. So I think of the Power BI administrator role as being a very high privileged role because it can affect so many things that are very important for a user experience. There's also a whole lot of other administrators and teams involved. And these are some of the biggies that the Power BI administrator would work with. And granted, if you're in a smaller company, you know, you might wear the SharePoint administrator or the Teams administrator hat as well. That can certainly happen as well. Before I move on to, you know, talking just briefly about who, any other questions that we want to address yet?
All right. We have a couple. We have Rick, who said about his role doing DAX and inquiries are part of the system, or his role there.
Yeah, so I tend to call, you know, when we're doing DAX work and, you know, creating our data model and, you know, creating our data set, preparing it for use with reports, I tend to think of that as a role like a Power BI author or creator, you know, whatever you want to call it. And can an administrator absolutely create content for others? No doubt about it. But in my brain anyways, I tend to classify those roles differently. But doesn't mean that you don't spend some time doing that.
All right. We also have Chewy Varela said that was his formally doing the administration role.
Oh, okay.
And then
Good.
we have an interesting point here by Christine Galuk, where she states, premium capacity role could get interesting with the push hitting our tenants with the self-service purchase of PPU.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about premium PPU, the evolution of Gen 2. So yeah, hang on to that thought. I agree with what you're talking about for sure. All right, good deal. I like all the chatter.
And we have one more here. We have Denise, who is laughing at the comments on users finding out they can do some action, but is controlled for specific reasons by an administrator.
Yes. Indeed. My favorite story about that is somebody's insisting to me that the tenant setting to be able to push apps to users must be a premium feature because he couldn't do it. I'm like, no, it's not premium. And so he can't, he was the leader of Power BI in his business unit, right? But he was not an administrator, so he couldn't see the settings. So he didn't know. He's just like, oh, I can't do it, so it must be premium. It's like, oh, no. So speaking of who is and isn't a Power BI administrator, there's a balance here, right? And so we want at least 2 people to be Power BI administrators, but we do not want too many people to be Power BI administrators because that increases our risk. And because of all of these tenant settings, because of the workspace management, which I'll show you in a minute, it is a really high privileged role. And so I get a little bit nervous when I see companies that, because there's not a read-only administrator role, sometimes the people in business units that squawk the loudest get to be added as an administrator, even though they're not really formally charged with that role. They just want to be able to go in and see how things are set. So that's a little bit of a pain point right now for sure. So I'm just curious, toss in the chat for me, is the number of people allowed to be Power BI admins set really well in your company? Is it a little out of control? You know, kind of toss a comment in there, and we'll see what that comes up to be here in a couple minutes when we pause. So let me first just clarify, what do I mean by the Power BI administrator role? And let me pull this over here. And we have the notion of a global administrator, which can do everything in Microsoft 365 and in Azure. But there's also a whole lot of lower classified roles, if you will, targeted roles. So SharePoint administrators, Teams administrators, Exchange administrators, etc. And the Power BI administrator role did not exist initially. Now, it has been here for quite some time, but there's still a little bit of a myth out there sometimes where people say, oh, I can't be a Power BI admin because you have to be a global admin. And so that is no longer true, right? And so this is the role inside the Microsoft 365 Admin Center that we are referring to, that controls being able to manage the Power BI service directly. But keep in mind that the global administrators, which are usually all just IT people, that one really is a very, very high privileged role. They can also manage the Power BI service because of the global aspect. I have a video on my YouTube site, and I'll have a link to it here for a moment. So I'm not going to elaborate on this a lot. I just want to introduce this idea, and then you can kind of circle back and watch that video if you're interested. But in the past, what has happened is we assign individuals. So here I'm showing administrator 1, 2, and 3 being assigned to the Power BI administrator role, and those are the people that can manage the Power BI service. You might say, well, yeah, Melissa, duh. But there's a better way. And I just want to let you know that there is this better way. And first, though, we got to say, if I've been assigning individuals to a role, because you can't assign a group to the Power BI administrator role back in Microsoft 365, what if I also have a group, right? And I'm using that group to say, affect certain tenant settings, or I'm using my security group for some workspace access, or I'm using it for various alerting in my automation jobs, that kind of thing, right? Lots of uses for a security group for my Power BI administrators. What that means is I get myself into a situation where I'm managing the role membership individuals and the group member individuals, right? And that's risk. They're going to get out of sync at some point. You know it's going to happen. So there's a very new feature that has come about just in the fall. And basically what this allows you to do is instead of assigning the individuals directly to the role, we assign them to the group, and then the role gets assigned to the group, right? And that's beautiful. Now, the other really, really interesting thing about this, because we're managing the role membership via this group, I can, in Azure Active Directory, I can define who the group owner is. Effectively, what this does is it means I can assign management of who the administrators are to whomever the group owner is assigned. So if central IT or your security team really wants to assign that work to somebody else, they absolutely can. And by the way, this concept works for a whole bunch of stuff, not just, the Power BI admin. So on that note, here are the administrator related groups that are useful to have if we don't count, groups that we need to manage the tenant settings, right? There's a whole bunch of individual ones that we'll want, and we'll look at those in a minute. But we want a Power BI administrators group. This needs to be a security group, and that's how we're going to manage our role. And we can also do some, various other normal work with it, right? Now, we also have, and here's the trade-off, the group up here cannot be a mail-enabled security group because that's actually an exchange group. It can't be that. So the trade-off that I am willing to accept is that we have a secondary Power BI admin alerting group that we use whenever we want to generate emails. Yes, we are maintaining it twice. So you might say, Melissa, did we gain anything? And that's for you to decide, right? But this is at least one way that you could go about setting up things. And then the other 3 groups that I think are useful to have, and you do want these to be either a mail-enabled security group or one of the newfangled, Microsoft 365 groups. And you want your gateway admins, your capacity admins, and your Power BI support folks. And to kind of just finish wrapping up this conversation about who is an administrator, the other idea that I just want to give you is that it is also possible to reduce the number of administrators. So there is a feature in Azure Active Directory called PIM, or Privileged Identity Management, and it's all about just-in-time access. And the whole idea here is if you've ever had 2 accounts assigned to you, right? One is your regular account and one's your admin account, and you log in sometimes with your admin account. This is the kind of thing that we can do instead in order to save you from having to do that. And then it also saves you from, if you do just have your regular account, you don't have to have that domain user have permanent full-time elevated permissions. So how this works is your security administrator sets up your roles in PIM, so in the privileged identity management area of Azure Active Directory, and eligible members. So in this case, let's say we have Joe. Joe is eligible to be a Power BI administrator when he needs to do something, but he doesn't need to do anything very often. And so he's set up as an eligible member. So when he needs to do something like check a tenant setting, for instance, he would pop into Azure AD, request to activate it. Optionally, you can have someone approve it first. He becomes a full-time member of that role for the 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever it is that he needs, and then he's automatically removed at the end of those hours. So a whole bunch of the stuff that I just breezed through very quickly, I gave you a link to the blog and the video here so that you can kind of go through it a little bit slower. So just want to introduce some ideas there about, who, reducing having too many admins, and considering using the privileged identity management to reduce the overall risk. So before we dive into the service, any comments or questions that we want to check on?
Oh yes, and I believe you probably addressed some of the questions here. So let's start here with one that may not be there, which is how can we check which role is assigned to one's account? For example, for myself, how can I check which role is assigned to my account? I think that's what the person means. This coming from Suprit Kaur.
Yeah, so that's where, if we pop back over to my Azure Active Directory, so here's where, you basically have to be able to say, let's look at, Peyton is my Power BI administrator, right? So I can go in and see, Come on. Get this page to refresh properly here. I can go in and see the assigned roles for Peyton. And so the thing is, though, is that if you do that thing that I just talked about where you're actually a member of the group and it's the group that's member of the role, right? You wouldn't see it directly here. Oh, they fixed it, they fixed it, they fixed it. I take that back. Scratch that statement. This person, my Power BI administrator, is the only person who has a direct assignment over in Microsoft 365. And my other people are through the group, including this one. So, oh, I'm so excited they fixed that. Now, if you don't have permission to view Azure Active Directory data, then I think you'd have to talk to someone in IT to be able to figure out how to see that information. So if you wanted to start querying it, the Microsoft Graph APIs are your friend for sure.
All right, but as an individual, can I see that assignment, which roles assigned to me?
I think you have a limited view even if you're not an administrator, but I would have to go in and double check that. If any of you that are listening happen to know off the top of your head, feel free to toss the answer in the chat for sure. But I'd have to double check that. But you do have some limited views. I'm just not sure if roles are one of them.
All right. We do have a few more questions here. One is, can Power BI administrator register a gateway as well?
You have to have special permissions, and we're going to get to that in the gateway section. But in case you're not still around, there is, hang on, not that. Hang on, there we go. There is in the Power Platform Admin Center, there is an option to manage your gateway installers, and you can do this through a PowerShell commandlet as well. So these are my two people in my demo tenant that are allowed to install gateways. This only affects the enterprise gateway. It doesn't affect the personal gateway, but there's also a PowerShell commandlet that that you can set. So kind of the combination of the two can get you where you're at. And I have that in the slides later when we get to the gateway section.
All right. And now from Christine Geluk, who is infopreneur too, and Power BI and admin. She would like to know, is there too many relative? I'm sorry. I think she refers to, is there too many? When you say too many people, I believe, relative, depending on the size of the organization. And is there other criteria or golden rule in your opinion? I think it's like how you assign the number of individuals to be a Power BI admin. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Christine.
Yeah. So here's the thing, and this is perfect timing because we are about to go into the Power BI service. So if you'll give me a moment, I'm actually going to answer that question. So tenant settings, right? Those are kind of the top of the list of things for you to get right. And like we briefly mentioned before, there's not a reader role, and that's a challenge in bigger decentralized organizations. So there's a series of slides that are coming. I'm going to actually go through this in demo form. Whoops, hang on. My bad, click. Let's try that one more time. Let's go to the admin portal. There we go. So here's the thing. This role cannot be decentralized. We cannot, for any of this kind of stuff in the admin portal, we cannot say this only affects the finance group, right? Even if we are saying that, for instance, just to use an example of, who can create workspaces, right? This is affecting, everybody. So for that reason, I think if we're looking for a golden rule, Azure administrators, the formal documentation always says the ideal number is 2 to 4. right? That's enough that you have backup people, not too many that you have too much risk. So I tend to think that that's also a good number. But you're right, there's not a perfect number by any means.
All right.
What?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay. Yep, go ahead. I think I've underestimated the number of questions, but that's okay. That's why we're here. Go for it. And
Oh.
then I'll resume. The next thing we're going to do is review our tenant settings.
There's a question here. What APIs did you say get data about the role assignment?
That would be the Microsoft Graph APIs. And we'll touch on that very briefly when we get to the auditing section at the very end of our presentation. Although now we're running woefully late, but that's okay, because if you have questions, I would rather answer them, and so that's okay. But yeah, that's kind of outside the specific set of Power BI APIs, but is very important data to kind of marry up to your Power BI data for sure.
All right. Thanks everybody for asking questions here. Feel free to continue to drop those questions. And it's all you now, Melissa.
All right, good deal. So the tenant settings, right? We know that those are very, very important. So what I want to do is just call out a few of the really important ones that I want you to be aware of from an administrator perspective. They're all important for one reason or another, but I'm going to try to find a little focus here. One of them here is email notifications if there's any sort of a service outage or incident, right? Just, I think it was last week, right? Azure Active Directory had an outage. It affected a whole bunch of things. I got one of these related to Power BI. Here, if you remember my groups that we talked about earlier, here's my Power BI administrator alerting group that I'm using for this particular purpose. Create workspaces. This is a huge one, right? We could spend the next hour talking about workspace management all by itself, right? But I've got some groups here in my demo tenant. I'm saying here are certain people that I've allowed to be workspace creators. My Power BI support and my Power BI administrators, security groups, all these people can create workspaces. And this just really depends on your governance policy for who's allowed to use that. Using data sets across workspaces, that's something I propose is always allowed to be the entire organization. If you have a use case that says, here's why we don't allow that, I'd love to hear about it in the chat. But I'm a big proponent of using live connection and using shared data sets and separating data workspaces and report workspaces, and we need this to make that work. We've got some information protection settings about who's allowed to apply sensitivity labels. In my demo tenant, I'm allowing the entire organization. This is one of those really tricky ones. Do you want to allow all of your workspace authors to be able to edit a sensitivity label, or do you want to restrict that to a much smaller population of people? If you have a policy on that that's working really well, I'd be interested to see that in the chat. These three right here about guest users are very, very important from a security aspect. So this first one basically opens the door, and it also requires Azure Active Directory to be configured properly as well to be able to allow guest users. So assuming both doors are open, then the next door, if you will, is who's allowed to invite external users. And this is, let's say you want to share a report, for instance, right? That would be referred to as ad hoc sharing. And these are the people that are allowed to do that. So if working with people outside your organization is super common, this might be wide open. If it's much more rare, it might be something that's controlled through a group like I'm showing in my demo tenant. And then here, these are the guest users that are actually allowed to edit and manage content. there are limitations to this. So I am told that people that try to make this work for real, a lot of times end up reverting just kind of using a regular native account. But this is a, kind of taking that guest user access item one step further. Publish to web, that's a great big one, right? Well-known suggestion and best practice to say we want to make sure that this is highly restricted to only the people that need to publish reports that are going to be seen publicly. And don't fool yourself thinking that, oh, I'm only using it in my intranet. It's not really public. It sure is really public if you're using the publish to web. So the Azure Active Directory security group that I'm using here, I've purposely named it so that it's really clear what it is, right? Publish to web is a feature of Power BI, right? And so I could use that, but public publishing, I think, is even clearer for somebody, say, just on the Azure AD side that isn't as familiar with Power BI. Got a whole bunch of, kind of export, download, etc. These got a lot more granular just in the last month or two. So if these are looking more detailed than the last time you saw them, that's because these got a really nice upgrade here recently. Certification is a great big one. So here's a group of people who is allowed to certify data sets and reports, etc. Again, something that from a governance perspective should be fairly restricted to just the subject matter experts that are qualified and trained to do that the way we want it to. Let's see here. Oh, there's that push apps to end users that I kind of told the quick story about before. So here you can see where I'm using some decentralized groups like my content admins in the sales team that I've trained. Hey, don't overuse this capability, right? We don't want people, and by people I mean just regular users on their apps menu. We don't want things to just start popping up like a popcorn popper all the time. But if it's used judiciously, this saves people from having to go find and install apps on their own. Let's see, visuals. This is some important information. So certified visuals are something that is really useful for expanding the built-in functionality of Power BI. So the recommendation that I usually give, and I jotted it in the slides for you, is if you say A, we're going to allow certified visuals only, and B, to make sure that that also takes effect in Power BI Desktop, we use group policy, and then any exceptions of things that we want to be allowed are handled over here in organizational visuals, which we'll look at here in a second. Let's see here. There's only a couple things. Don't use the data classification for dashboards. Just disable that. I'm hoping that they formally just, retire that. With the new sensitivity labels, those are 1,000% better functionality. Let's see here. I'm going to skip the service principles. They're very, very important. Given how much time we have at the end, we'll circle back and talk about these a little bit more. But the thing that I wanted to point out, here we go. This is what I'm looking for. This just popped up this weekend. This is brand spanking new. And so this one, I don't know if it's formally documented yet, but this is a really interesting one because it's saying only the dataset owner can overwrite or republish a dataset through either, regular dataset updates or a deployment pipeline update. This is enabled for the whole darn organization. So I'm not entirely certain that I buy that it will be super useful organization-wide. Certainly some customers must ask for it because it has landed. However, I think it will be selectively useful. So here's your suggestions that I have for you for tenant settings. There's a lot of stuff there. We only kind of glanced at about, a fourth of them. What I propose that you do is document the decisions that you made, right? And that includes which groups are allowed to be enabled for a particular setting. And then if there's a process for how to get approved for a group, document that as well. And so somewhere in your internal hub of information that you have for your Power BI users, right? Hopefully you have somebody, whether it's a formal center of excellence or not, right? But somebody that's publishing helpful information for your internal users, right? Then people have a place to go and reference what are our settings if I wanted to be able to push apps to end users, for instance, what group would I have to be part of, right? Then the other thing I want you to do is think about tracking in the activity log. The activity when a tenant setting changes is called updated admin feature switch. And that's especially useful if you have more people that have been added to Power BI admins than you would like to, right? So kind of minimize the risk of that. And then you can also set up alerts for if any changes occur. The way I like to do that is through a tool called Cloud App Security. It's separate from Power BI, it's separate licensing, separate permissions, but we can start doing some data loss prevention type stuff and some alerting like the one shown here. So that's something that I've done its own blog post and video about. Actually, that one might have just been a blog post. That might be mislabeled. But anyways, there's more information for you there. Let me pause and ask, before I move on and talk about workspaces next, any questions about tenant settings specifically that we want to tackle?
I don't see any at this time, so folks remember, oops, there we go, just pop up a question here from Christine Gillock. She's asking, and folks remember, if you have a question, remember to subscribe, and you have the live chat, drop your question in there. Also, do not forget to drop a comment on the presentation here, on the comment section down there. All right, back at the live chat, we have Christine Gillock. Would you consider the inside step with tenant settings part of the Power BI governance? Should there be such a thing? So would you consider the insight step with tenant settings part of Power BI governance?
I feel like the word insight is tripping me up. So I hope I answer this, what you're looking for. I think that what all of the tenant settings decisions are is definitely part of your governance policies and processes, kind of that overall set of things that you want to think about for how to make sure Power BI is managed and meets the goals that you have, right? And that goes back to those 3 columns we looked at the beginning, right? Who's going to manage data, who's going to be allowed to publish reports, et cetera, the whole enterprise BI, self-service BI thing. And then we start drilling into more detailed things like specific tenant settings. So I absolutely think that, yes, whoever is in charge of Power BI governance should have a say in the decisions, and then the administrator just goes and makes the approved change. So I was sitting in a conference room once with some folks, and I said, oh yeah, there's a new setting to go do blah, blah, blah. And the administrator just went right then and there and changed it. Now, who am I to say that he's wrong? Because I don't work in that company. It might be that that's the perfect thing that he should have done, but it did make me have just a moment of pause to say, well, should he be making that choice independently and just making that change on the fly? So.
All right, let's take a look here on the, so Christine, hope it answered your question. Otherwise, just drop you may clarify and drop it in the live chat. We also have here one from the Student Support UK. Is there any setting to enable to publish to apps report?
I don't understand the question the way it's phrased. So if you could be more specific the next time we take questions, I will answer it. If I'm guessing the way that you're phrasing it, if I go to a workspace that has an app with it, really there's not a tenant setting to say you can or can't publish apps. It's more about, if I go to the access, it's more about who has the proper role for the workspace and is allowed to publish an app. And I can't think of anything that says, nope, don't allow any apps, I think.
All right, support, Student Support UK, let us know if that addresses your question there. Otherwise, clarify.
Wait, hang on.
Yep.
Let me think about this a second. We know we don't want anybody to use the organizational content packs. So I haven't used this setting in a while. So I gotta stop and think. Yeah, this is more about templates though. So that's not it. That's a template. Push. And then this one is just more about publishing the app to the entire org and not publishing an app in itself. So, okay, I stand by my original answer. And if anybody knows any different, toss it in the chat.
And so Student Support said that you got it, you understood his question there.
Cool.
We also, and I think you can probably address two questions in one shot here. So one is about, I have from Francisco. He's asking, I have Azure security groups, but they don't show in the Power BI tenant settings. Do you know why this happens?
It has to be a security group, and it can't be, for tenant settings, it can't be like a Microsoft 365 group, because you can create those in Azure too. So it has to be only a security group.
All right, and the other one is kind of it's from Denise, and I would say that goes more in depth into the Azure Directory groups. She's asking if there are policies and annual or semi-annual recertification, if you will. And we also use control for any platform changes. So I think she's saying how she configures her tenant settings here.
Good. Okay, good. Yeah, and when we get to the security section, although we are running woefully late now, but when we get there, there's a couple of Azure Active Directory features that might be of interest to you there.
All right, so folks, remember, drop your question in the live chat, and it's all you there, Melissa.
Awesome. So the next thing, after tenant settings in the admin portal, the next big thing that I tend to think about is this workspace management. And although the admin might not get in here often, when they do, they have super high privileges. So for instance, here I have a workspace called device telemetry data, right? Even if me as an admin does not have permission currently to this workspace, I can modify the permission. So I can add myself, I can add somebody else. That, besides the thing we talked about earlier, right, that you can do so many things that affect user experience, the fact that I can affect security for all of these version 2 workspaces. So this doesn't apply to personal workspaces, and it doesn't apply to the old, Office 365 style workspaces if you haven't migrated off of all of those. But the V2 ones that are kind of the future of Power BI, that's a biggie. And then certainly through APIs, all of this information can be retrieved, the metadata, and managed as well. Now, the next item that an admin should maybe have a cadence where you take a look at what the embed codes are and double check that these are all correct. So monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, whatever makes sense to you, right? So here I've got an embed code that has been created through publish to web. I called it something super clear, right? Even in my workspace, I put public in the name to say that, oh yeah, this embed code is totally fine, that it's public. But the other thing that you can do when you are concerned about embed codes, as far as the activity log, you can look for a very specific activity called generate embed token. So if a new one popped up in between your auditing cadence, you could become aware of that as well. We touched on this briefly earlier. So organizational visuals. Here I've got one. So here, if I just use the screenshot, right, I've got one organizational custom visual, right? So this is not built into Power BI Desktop. It's a custom one that we said, let's register it for the organization. So I touched on this briefly, but my proposal is, at least as a starting point for discussion, enable just certified visuals only in your tenant setting. Make sure you use group policy so that Power BI Desktop acts the same as the service. The last thing you want is somebody in Power BI Desktop to go get something from AppSource, non-certified, spend gobs of time in desktop only to publish it to the service and find that it doesn't work. That's bad. So 1 and 2 need to go together to not make your users just very angry at you. And then you handle the exceptions with the organizational visuals. If you have anybody that internally develops them, that's great. You might have a vendor that you get a visual from, and it's not certified, but it's absolutely trustworthy. And an example of this would be, it needs to call in a machine learning algorithm, and it's never going to get certified in AppSource because of that, because you're not allowed to make a call back to your own servers. That kind of breaks the rules of being certified, but it's an absolutely valid use case. So, somebody, whether it's the admin or someone else, right, validates that the vendor is trustworthy, and then you just, you register it here in the organizational visuals. The other big advantage here is everybody sees it in their Power BI Desktop when it's been registered here. So you don't have individual people getting the PBI Viz files in desktop and managing all the versions separately themselves. The admin does it once here and everybody sees it. So it's very, very helpful for user experience. There's also Azure connections here. And so there's one that you set for, this is the data lake that we want to set for the tenant itself. And then there's a checkbox for, I want to allow workspace admins to connect their own storage account. So when you're using data flows, if you've done none of this, your data is still sitting in Azure Data Lake. You just don't see it, right? Just like anything else for data sets, right? You don't actually see and connect to that data, but it's there somewhere. But with data flows, if you set this up, you can actually access that data. And if you have an objective to reuse data as much as possible and stop creating redundant multiple copies of data as much as possible, which are always great governance goals, then this kind of thing helps with that, right? Because then you can see the data from the back end, you can access it from other tools, et cetera, et cetera. The one thing that I do want to take a moment to alert you about, if I just go to settings here and I go to Azure Connections Preview and go to storage, right? Even if I've got that checkbox for workspace level storage set where we just were, right? It's never going to default to enable, well, at least current behavior, I should say, for your workspaces. So you always have to go in workspace by workspace and say which data lake do I want to connect to. So this is a little bit of a risk when workspaces are created. And the reason for that being a risk is because if you start creating data flows and you haven't set up your workspace settings correctly, you kind of have to get it all set up initially. So heads up there. Featured content. So back over here, back under my admin portal. This is kind of a little bit of a slightly more unusual one to be a Power BI administrator responsibility, but it goes back to understanding what the users are doing and being a little bit closer to them, working with them. So anyways, here are 3 items that are set to be featured content. There is a tenant setting for who's allowed to set featured content. So here we're saying just, our corporate BI content admins basically is what this name means. So how it ends up looking, if I go to my homepage, the 3 reports that are set to featured are right there. So as users start building their own history, right, of their favorites, their frequents and such, the featured moves down, but until they build history, the featured is up at the top. So anyway, it's something that you might want to make sure that you kind of make sure not too many people can drop a bazillion things into featured content. Let's talk a little bit about monitoring system health. There is the regular Power BI support site. And if we take a look at what's out there right now, there's just one item for awareness, and there are no outages going on. The only things that hit this page are the great, big, huge issues that affect everybody. If you are thinking more about an Azure service, so Azure Data Lake that we just talked about, for instance, sitting behind data flows, Power BI embedded, any of the other services, that have hooks into Power BI, Azure Premium Files, for instance, for your large models, et cetera, you would check Azure Status instead. The other thing to know, because again, Azure Status is also just going to be updated for the great big bad issues. Then you've got the admin center, and here's where a regular Power BI administrator is not going to be able to see this. But if there was an outage that affects you as a customer, maybe your region, whatever, and Microsoft, their SLA, right, takes effect. So they have these service level agreements to you as a Power BI customer to say Power BI needs to be up, I should know this, 4 nines, 5 nines, whatever the SLA is. And if there is downtime that possibly impacts that SLA, they are financially backed, right? And this is true for a whole bunch of Azure services too, right? So that means they owe you, the customer, what was the scope of the issue? What was the start time? What was the end time? What are we going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Any of that kind of stuff you find in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And last I checked, the history is there for like 30 days. So you'd kind of have to archive the info off if you need it. So a more elevated tenant admin would need to get that for you. So again, this is only for high priority incidents. If we talk about user support for a second, administrators often end up wearing a support hat, at least to a certain extent. So you want to think about your internal support people. What are they capable of handling and what requests are going to come in, right? So do data discrepancies come through support? Maybe, maybe not. Certainly things like technical troubleshooting, problems with updates and installations, that kind of stuff usually does. But with a tool like Power BI, that we have enterprise content and we have self-service content, right? Maybe there's a refresh failure that's happening. What is the actual support expectation. All of that needs to be super clear. So there does need to be certainly some internal support arrangements made. How much of that falls to the admin versus somebody else is a whole nother thing, and making sure that there is readiness for that. But there's also, the user support that Microsoft provides. The first one is kind of sort of not really support, right? But it's the community site. Lots of people just ask questions and the community offers answers. And, probably they're right, but you got to use your judgment to say, this person on the interweb has given me information, right? Do I trust it? Pro user support, right? Any user that's got a pro license can go ahead and just put in a support ticket here. And that's totally okay. And then from an administrator perspective, right? There is specific administrator support. And then finally, there is premier support. So I don't mean premium, I mean premier. And that would be like something that the big enterprise companies usually pay for premier support. So the idea here is that you don't have to do absolutely everything in-house or internally from a support perspective. Another thing, this is kind of a one-time thing, but if you don't know where your data is stored in Power BI, figure that out. It's not an easy process to move it if you don't like where it's at. But you do ideally want to think about, where's your Power BI tenant sit in relation to your data and your users, et cetera, et cetera. From a premium capacity perspective, that can sit in a different geography, but there's still going to be some networking connectivity that goes through what we would call your home tenant location. So if you find that your data is stored someplace that you absolutely do not want it to be, support can help you do the migration. A whole bunch of stuff is still manual by the customer, but support can help. If you need to merge tenants, so let's say, for instance, some subsidiary created their own tenant, and you're like, no, you need to be in our tenant. There's no support process or anything to merge. Support can only help you migrate to a new geographic region. And I think the last thing coming up in this section is user machines and devices. So this might fall to infrastructure, right? But it might fall to you. It's very important that the Power BI software be pushed to all of your content authors so everybody's on the same version. If everybody's got different versions and they're trying to share Power BI files, like PBIX files, right? One person works on a data set, somebody else the next day opens it up to modify a report. They're on different versions. They will be frustrated. There's a bunch of other things that you might need to help them get installed, right? One is drivers. So if they need to access certain data sources. One is the Analyze in Excel provider if they're going to do connectivity to data sets from Excel, which is a great thing, and it's getting more features. By the way, if you didn't see the announcement a couple weeks ago at Ignite, it's going to become a first-class citizen with regard to like refreshes and that kind of stuff, which is good. External tools, so advanced authors, right, that start using some of these other tools. Group policy settings, so that custom visuals example that we used earlier, and custom connectors. So if you have a very unique data source and you've either purchased or created a custom connector, all those kinds of things might need to also be installed on a user machine. As you can imagine, should be managed by IT in some form. All right. Questions about the service in general before we narrow our focus a little bit here to premium? Okay, and if everybody's happy with, hey, we'd rather get our questions answered, knowing that the topic is going to run long, I'm okay with that. We'll just have to take a little break here in a little while, let us stretch our legs, take a bio break, and that's all. That's totally fine with me. So I'm fine making this a much heavier Q&A session than I had originally envisioned. So let's do it.
All right, folks, you heard it. Let us know how you all like it.
We'll be here till midnight.
You know, it's a on the item you just presented. There's a night, and I'm gonna share with you a link here from Christine. She was mentioning whether the Twitter handle MSFT 365 status be the best source to monitor any outages, or are there any others? And I sent you like the.
I don't know if the outages are put. I don't know that I've ever noticed them on Twitter.
Yeah, I shared with you a link to it, and
Yeah.
if I don't know if you're familiar with that handle, but you know, they post things there regarding, you know, what's going on, issues, other infrastructure investigations they're carrying out, and things like that.
Oh, well, tell you what, I'm going to follow them. Hey.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to your question. I think you said it was from Christine.
Right.
I don't know if Power BI issues are posted here. So that's a great question, and I'm sorry, I don't know. But nonetheless, it sounds like a good one to follow, because sometimes related, especially Azure AD, could certainly be problematic. So certainly a good one to know about nonetheless. So thanks for sharing that.
Thanks for sharing the resource there, Christine. And I do not see any other questions, so it's all you, Melissa.
All right. So let's talk premium a little bit. Where I want to start is with kind of the building blocks a little bit, if you will. As things stand right now that premium per user, or PPU, has been released, what I want to do is talk about what we really have going on. So we can now have 4 kinds of workspaces. We have My Workspace, we have Pro Workspaces. We've had those for a long time, so that hopefully isn't new information, right? A premium workspace, and that would be a workspace that has been added to a premium capacity. We've had that for a long time. And now a PPU workspace would be a workspace that has been added to PPU. So, all right, knowing that we have 4 kinds, let's talk licensing for a second. To get to My Workspace, you need at least a free license. To get to a Pro Workspace, you need at least a Pro license. Very straightforward, yes. To get to a PPU workspace, you need a PPU license. And Premium Workspace is not user-based licensing, but it's capacity-based licensing. So you buy that either through P SKUs, EM SKUs, or A SKUs, which is a very large conversation. Capacity-based licensing that we've had for a while is known as Premium Gen 1. It is going through an evolution to Premium Gen 2. So there's basically kind of a migration happening. The PPU user-based premium licensing is Gen 2 only. And that's got some very serious, it's a big thing. So just to kind of clarify what we just said, but say it in a different way. If you're a free user, you can access content in My Workspace or in a premium workspace that's backed by full-fledged capacity. Okay, no PPU there. If you're a pro user, you can get to these top 2 and you can get to the bottom one. PPU user, you can get to anything. So the thing here is, here's the big kicker. To view content in a PPU workspace, you have to have a PPU license. Now, whether or not you as a Power BI administrator also are involved with license management, right? That depends on how big your company is and that kind of stuff, but you probably need to be aware of how many licenses you have, who's managing it, when you're pulling some of your activity data and your API data and that kind of stuff that we'll talk about later, right? Who's effectively using the licenses that they've been assigned and that kind of stuff. So the PPU one is a very big deal. The other thing that I want to mention briefly about this evolution to Gen 2 is that from a management perspective, Gen 1, any of you, if you've managed a premium capacity in Gen 1, you know that this is an art and a science, and the ability to overload a capacity with too many data sets, right, and basically just bring it to its knees is very real. Gen 2 moves to more of a Microsoft managed capacity, where there are a few things you, the customer, still need to be worried about, but Microsoft takes over a lot more of it. So there's less management to worry about. So Gen 2 is a very good thing. Very, very quickly, just in terms of why would we want to deal with going to premium, because a lot of times administrators are asked, should we move this to premium or help moving, certain workspaces into premium, et cetera, right? And the first one, which, by the way, this page is things that work in both PPU or full-fledged premium capacity. So if you want to use deployment pipelines, if you want to use paginated reports, and by this we mean the RDL reports that are published and work in the Power BI service. If you want to use the XMLA endpoint that we'll talk about here in a little bit, data flows gets a few more features. And for near real-time reporting, there's some change detection stuff that you can do that's kind of cool. There's some scalability features. This auto scale thing is new and only in Gen 2. So if you think about it like this, let's say at the end of every month, you have some bursts of activity and you don't sustain it all month long, but it just always happens, right? So if you have these occasional bursts of traffic, what you can do is you can also hook up a Power BI embedded service in Azure. When you have some sustained traffic that causes you to scale up, it'll auto scale itself up for 24 hours. You kind of pay that 24-hour amount, and then it'll scale itself back down. Because Power BI Premium itself, like P SKUs, has never, ever been focused on scaling up and down. It's not that kind of service. And then certainly Premium gives us stuff like larger data sets and more frequent refreshes than the 8 per day, et cetera. Gives us integration with other apps, et cetera. Now, there's a few things, by the way, that we only get with full-fledged premium capacity. And one of them is if you've got a ton of read-only users, and the break-even point a lot of times is about 500 users, right? And you want those viewers, those consumers, to just be able to view content with their free license and not have to give them a pro license. That's usually been kind of the #1 reason to move to premium. That's still full-fledged capacity. That's not a PPU thing. There's a couple of regulatory and privacy things. So if you want to manage your own encryption key, if you want to set specific geography for where your data is stored, like in Canada, for instance, that you would need to do with full-fledged premium capacity. And if you want to use Power BI report server. So RDLs, paginated reports, we can publish them to the Power BI service with a PPU license. But if we want to publish to Power BI report server as an alternative, we do have to have like the full-fledged capacity. And basically what happens there is however many cores you bought, you get a corresponding report server license for the same number of cores. Now, this is more so a Gen 1 consideration, but we're going to be in the evolution of Gen 1 to Gen 2 for a long time. So admins, capacity admins kind of need to do some analysis of if I have multiple smaller capacities, and this occurs to me, I hid a few slides to save time, but it occurs to me that I got a little too excitable and hid one that you should see. So let me explain what I mean by multiple smaller capacities first. Let's say I bought a P3 with 32 vCores. If I wanted to in Power BI, I can set up 3 different capacities that then have, so capacity 1 here with only 16 cores has, 3 workspaces assigned to it. So we can carve them up differently in the Power BI service than how we bought them. So now if we come back to this that I was trying to say, the 3 different carving up that I just showed would be really appropriate, especially if as an admin, you have people publishing data sets from, say, let's say 3 different departments, right? And you kind of need to isolate them from each other, because if you overload a capacity, you are affecting the other users in the capacity. Again, much, much, much more a Gen 1 thing than a Gen 2 thing. But if you have a single larger capacity and you just said, oh, let's put the whole 32 of my P3 here in Power BI together, right? Then I can't set up capacity admins, I can't isolate, etc. So very much an analysis of, what makes sense. There is a capacity metrics app to help you manage this. There's a new one for Gen 2. Thankfully, there is less stuff for you to have to deal with and try to manage. So if you haven't yet devoted time to learn capacity management really deeply, don't bother now, because Gen 2 is going to save you from a lot of that. You also want to make sure that you've got the email notifications, that tenant setting, the very first one we looked at, I believe, for notifications. Capacity overload alerts would come through that as well. And then the activity log, you want to think about understanding how did we think this premium capacity was going to be used, and if we're having issues with it, does it align with what we thought was going to happen, right? That kind of thing. All right, so we didn't talk about that in a whole heck of a lot of detail, but any comments or questions about premium capacities there? If anybody's, using, tell me in the chat if you're using premium now, and is it really, really important to your implementation, or, kind of a core thing you can't live without now, or is it, we use it for a little bit here and there, that kind of thing.
All right, let's take a look here on the questions. And folks, remember, just drop your question and comments in the live chat. So we have here Denise, and she's asking, are you saying that, for example, I have a 32 vCore as a premium customer. I also have 32 for paginated reporting services. You said nodes, but are those interchangeable in the conversation?
Yeah, that kind of depends on how we use our terminology. So if we go to the admin portal, and here's where, by the time we tell Power BI, I have capacity and what workspaces to assign it to, Power BI kind of doesn't care how you bought it, right? So mine, this is a demo tenant. So mine is from Power BI embedded, so I can pause it when I don't need it, right? And save my Azure credits. So that's why we're going over here. But you said, oh, there we go, that's what I'm looking for. So you said a second ago, paginated reports. So we don't assign nodes per se to workloads, but we do assign, like, if we expect paginated reports to be a really important part, right? Give it more memory, right? If we don't expect, so for instance here, I said I don't expect this capacity to be used for AI at all. So yeah, I turned it off. That kind of thing. Now, if we go to the PPU settings though, purposefully, because Microsoft is managing it, we don't have all those workload settings, right? I can't say I want my data flows to have 50% of the whole capacity memory, and et cetera, et cetera. So I can set a couple things here for that near real-time reporting, controlling that. And I can set the XML endpoint, is it read-only or read-write? And here shortly, if that's foreign words to you, I'll explain to you what that means here shortly. Do note, though, that that is the entire Power BI tenant if you set it to be read-write. So I have no idea if it'll evolve to be like a workspace level setting, but it's not. So anyways, my example here for what I'm able to show you, since I don't have multiple ones, right? But it would just be this level right here. That's the A4 size, and that would dictate how many nodes I'm giving to this particular capacity, and then start, assigning workspaces to it, etc. Oh, that's right. I removed all my workspaces recently. I forgot. I did that for a reason. I got to add them back. That's right. I was testing. Somebody asked me if we are changing some things with Premium and I move out and back in. Does it take a long time? Does it bring down, make content unavailable? And I'm presuming that it's just a metadata change and didn't take long. So I was doing some testing. So anyway.
Yeah, so Denise just answered saying, yep, she was just making sure, and yes, definitely setting memory max, thanks. And yes, Gen 2 is dedicating a container per paginated refresh needs. So PPU makes sense.
Perfect, yeah. And so there's a new icon here. If I even zoom in just a little bit more, right, you can see the diamond with a little person, and that means this is a PPU workspace. Awesome. And so I removed my other ones. Otherwise, if we just saw the diamond by itself, you would know that's a regular premium capacity workspace.
And we have one from Chris. I'm sorry, anything else?
Go ahead. Nope.
All right, we have one from Christine as well. I believe she means a general question for an organization that may not have premium capacity license, but has a PPU for the developer. So will the developer have the PPU license with their Power BI Pro license as well? Or when they go to PPU, it just transition to PPU? I believe that's the question.
Yeah, if just the one person has PPU, right, that might be useful if that person is, say, doing a deployment pipeline from a dev workspace over to a prod workspace that's sitting in full-fledged premium capacity, right? That's the kind of thing where an isolated PPU license might make sense. Or that person's setting up, a bunch of subscriptions inside that workspace, right? But for the most part, if one person has it and other people are collaborating in the workspace with them, they'll all need PPU.
All right, let us know. I believe that addresses the question there, Christine. And thank you, Melissa, and it's all you there.
All right, so gateways. We're not going to go too deep in this, but the biggest thing that I want to do is introduce that we now have 3 kinds of gateways. So 2 modes have been around for a long time. We have had what we call the standard mode for a while, which is a gateway cluster of 1, 2, 3, or however many machines you set up. So you, the customer, configures a virtual machine or a server or whatever, installs the gateway software, and is running it. There is the dreaded personal mode data gateway that is useful in certain situations. However, from a governance perspective, we usually want to minimize the extent of personal mode gateways. And then now there is recently announced a new virtual network data gateway. So we'll talk more about that in a second. But in a nutshell, it solves the problem of a customer needing to run gateway machines. So with standard mode, you see how it's showing here in the middle, 3 different servers. The The gateway software is updated every single month. You, the customer, has to go and update the software, run these servers, keep them patched, et cetera, right? The virtual network data gateway is all managed by Microsoft, but here's the kicker. It only works on premium workspaces. So theoretically, conceptually, I should say, what's happening here is we have some data sources on premises or in the cloud inside of a virtual network of some variety, right? And Power BI needs to reach these services. And so it uses this gateway that understands how to reach these data sources. And we'll talk here in a minute about how does it know what data sources to reach. Now, technically speaking, if you install a standard mode data gateway, it can be shared amongst all of these different services. Keep in mind that as of right now, unless something new has snuck in recently that I haven't heard, they share the gateway software and they share the ability to connect, but they do not share actual data source configuration. Those are still separate. And notice that Azure Data Factory and Azure Machine Learning are not services that share the same gateway. If you also connect to those, that's a different gateway and you want to install it on a different server. So when the heck do we need one of these gateways, right? One is if we're refreshing an imported data set, right? So somebody could be working in desktop, they're refreshing, they're building, they're working for days, they published it to the service and they go, oh, my refresh fails. Also, if you refresh a data flow, same idea. Direct query or live connection to analysis services. All those things mean you need a data gateway if you're doing that. And the data center is, on-prem within your corporate network, basically. If you've got a virtual machine inside of Azure, right, that acts just like it's sitting in your corporate network. If you've got what I call a cloud-based data set in a virtual network, so basically something like Azure SQL database sitting inside your virtual network in Azure that also acts like it's on premises. So any of those actions and the data source is behind that boundary. And then there's an or here. There's certain functionality that if you do these things inside of Power Query, the query editor, it just kind of needs the gateway in order to do some work. So back to the three kinds of gateways, right? So the personal mode is intended for use by one user, and it's installed on somebody's laptop. So that one user is who is managing your personal mode gateway. The standard mode, the one that's been around for a long time, is intended to use for many users. So your admin registers it once, lots of people connect through it, also customer managed. And then as we talked about before, the new one is managed by Microsoft, but only works for your content in premium workspaces. Now, there's also some differences here in terms of what functionality it supports. So if we start with the simple one on the right, the personal mode gateway only does data refresh. And then it does the odd one, right? If you've got anybody that's doing R or Python at the very, very beginning of your query editor, and I mean the actual data source connectivity. So I don't mean R visuals or anything like that that's sort of downstream. I just mean for initial data connectivity. The first two, the VNet and the standard mode gateways, they're not allowed to connect because it represents a security risk, basically. So you gotta use the personal mode for that. You can install the personal mode gateway on the same server as an enterprise gateway. Pardon me, standard mode. It hasn't been called the enterprise gateway in years, and I still have old habits die hard. So you can kind of circumvent that. My suggestion is if you have people that are using R and Python for that data connectivity, maybe see if that is absolutely necessary, right? Can they just use native Power Query connectivity for that first piece, right? And then go to town and do whatever you want past that. The standard mode, right? It can do data refresh, it can do direct query, it can do live connection, right? The one of those that is new now to the new VNet one is if you are doing single sign-on, so the SSO, using direct query to a Power BI data set. So if you've seen all the new fuss and excitement in the community about the new composite model functionality, right? The extended ability to reuse enterprise data sets, that kind of stuff, right? That's a new thing that the VNet capability brings. All right, so from a setup perspective, on every gateway server, so this is that standard mode where you're running the servers, you need to install your gateway server software, any custom drivers. So same thing that your users need to install on their machines to connect to things like HANA, etc. Any custom connectors, the gateway server needs it too. And the gateway software is updated every single month. Most customers that I've talked to, they more like do the gateway updates quarterly. But here's the thing, Microsoft only supports the last 6 versions of the gateway software. So formally, you're out of support if your gateway software is more than 6 months old. And the thing is, desktop gets updated every month, right? There's that M engine, all that kind of stuff. You want them to align. So even though it's a little bit painful, keep that gateway server updated. The other thing that you want to do with regard to gateway software updates every month, you want to create yourself a reusable set of gateway testing reports, right? And so you install the software on your dev test machine, and then you run a refresh for source type number 1 and a refresh for source type number 2 and a direct query for another source type, right? You make sure that, yep, this software update works great, move on to your prod. From a specs perspective, the first thing to know is that your gateway server does more than just connectivity. Sometimes it does work. So if you're familiar with query folding, you know that we love to push the work to an underlying source server if we can. But if we can't, the gateway server does work to do transformations and merges, et cetera, et cetera. So what that means is we need CPU, we need memory, and certainly we need bandwidth. So rule of thumb, right? We need more CPU if we're going to do a lot of direct query and live connection. And we always need as much memory as you can possibly give it. And that's, rule of thumb, more important for data refresh than it is for direct query. So what you want to think about setting up. So in the chat, I'm curious if you're willing to admit it. Do you have multiple servers running in your production gateway cluster, or do you only have one? So here's what I suggest is that on your production gateway cluster, you have at least 2 machines. And we have 3 goals for this. One is we have eliminated our single point of failure. Should something go wrong with one of those machines, the other one can still service your direct query activity, your live connection activity, your refreshes, right? You don't have an emergency if one machine has a problem. It can do load balancing, right? So theoretically, our performance is better if we're gonna send data refresh number 1 to the first server, data refresh number 2 to the second server, that kind of thing. And third, rotating updates. So that thing that I just described a minute ago about testing your software update, right? When you get to prod, you can perform a software update on server number 1, while server number 2 and 3 or whatever are still serving up your refresh, direct query, etc., and just basically rotate through them. So you don't necessarily, unless your IT team forces you to, right? You don't have to have, a maintenance window outage, especially if you've done your testing on the dev test first, and then you feel pretty confident that we're not going to bring down production. The other thing I will mention is that gateway for dev test, I do think it's important to have one. I don't care if it's a real cluster. I kind of, you might have a requirement in your IT group for it to match production. And if so, okay. But in my experience, as long as we have something, it can have less resources, it can have less machines. If we have a way to test the software updates and test stuff, I don't care if it's less powerful. But again, that may or may not fly in your organization. So the last couple points that I want to make on Gateway before we move from it are just a couple things that tend to get people tripped up a little bit. One thing is that the administrators are assigned at the gateway level. This gets even trickier because in the Power Platform Admin Center, administrators are called users. So that's fun. Users, however, the way Power BI Gateway Management refers to them, are set per individual data source. So let's say I have a data source, right, that's a SQL Server and a data source that's a data lake, etc. This is actually a good thing that users are set per data source, right? It gives us that ability to manage access at, that more granular level. So yeah, it's more work, but it's a good thing. Here's the deal. You got to be prepared if you as an administrator are responsible for any of this support. You got to be prepared to quickly handle failures in the service due to, oh, I got a new data source that somebody published, a new Power BI desktop file. It's got a new data source. We don't have it registered in the gateway. So there's that. Or the data source is registered, but as a user, I published my desktop file, but I'm not in the user list, so my refresh is failing. From a management perspective, there are companies, because this is kind of a regular bit of work, it works pretty well to decentralize management of the data sources and the users if you want to, right? So you could set up multiple gateway clusters, allow people in certain business units to be those administrators, and administer the data sources and the users. That can be decentralized well compared to other things from a Power BI management perspective that can't. The last couple things that I'll mention, if we switch to the virtual network data gateway, I just want to make a couple distinctions. One of them is that your gateway and the data sources have to be in the same virtual network. The only data sources supported right now are a few Azure data sources that, of course, will expand, but they've started out small and simple. And the data set down here that we are connecting to and trying to refresh, etc., needs to be in a premium workspace. And our final note is just on monitoring health and activity. There are these 4 log files that you can enable on every single gateway server that you manage. And this is what they end up being named. They give some really useful information. I suggest doing this way back when we did some pretty heavy testing on confirming that they don't have a lot of extra load on the machine. But there are some config values that you can set to say, only capture a snapshot of, say, CPU pressure, for instance, every 10 minutes instead of every 5 minutes, right? So you can manage some of that, but these are really, really helpful. So if you don't have these enabled, I would suggest that you do that. And with that, that moves us to security. Any comments or questions about what did we just talk about? The data gateways before we move on to security.
Yes, we do. And those who come in and subscribe and log in to the YouTube can use live chat to enter their questions. And here we have Denise, who said that yes, they do. They have multiple, and they have both environments for testing and of course
Awesome.
production there. We do have a,
Awesome. Big high five.
yeah, and also from Kevin, we have a question here. Is the VNet gateway scalable at all, meaning load balance, etc.?
It just got announced in the last couple of weeks, and I have not had a chance to configure it and test it. So I do not have those answers for you in terms of, scalability. But it is Microsoft managed, so I would hope that all of that's there. But we all know that a lot of times new features come out and kind of need a little bit of time to grow up and mature and expand, so to speak. So yeah, that's something that we would have to look into.
All right. We also have a question here from Denise. She would like to know, or actually, like, can you repeat on your statement about data sources and the virtual networks must be in the same?
Virtual network, yeah. So it's in Azure, and there's this notion of a virtual network. So if in Azure you're familiar with the idea of a resource group, right? It's just kind of a bucket. Think of a virtual network as kind of the same thing, but it's a networking boundary. And so if you don't have permission to access resources that all live in the same bucket or virtual network, then you're blocked. So it's networking stuff that is definitely not my specialty, but that's kind of the conceptual piece of it.
All right, that's great info there.
Since we've been going for 2 hours now, and what we have left, by the way, we have security, which this is not a huge topic, just, kind of like the last one, a few things for you to think about and know about. And then we have auditing and monitoring. Again, not going to go into it. And then we wrap. I'll tell you is just barely dipping our toes into this topic. So let's talk about just a few of the most important relevant items. And where I want to start is that, holy cow, we have content everywhere. So let's think about this. We've got our source data, right, sitting in databases or wherever. And granted, that's not Power BI, but we're going to get data in Power BI that comes from there, right? We have files stored in file servers, OneDrive, etc. And this includes our Power BI desktop files, our paginated report files, our Excel workbooks. We might have some source data files, right? A flat file that we maintain of just something that we use as a source. We might have some various other external files. And then we publish that data up to the Power BI service, right? And here's all of our main content types. Then we've got content we export from the Power BI service. We've got Power BI files we can export. We've got PowerPoints, PDFs, little data exports. We've got our email subscriptions. And then we've got content embedded in other services. So, oh my gosh, so managing all of this from a security aspect is, well, not a tiny thing. And few people think about the files, right? So I propose that you have guidance for, your population of Power BI users. So that's what I mean by your internal user community. So, where are you going to keep your source files and your source data? And those first two are primarily targeting your authors. And then you've got things that come out of Power BI, right? Your subscriptions, your exports, etc. And that's kind of everybody, including your consumers, right? Do you have guidance for them on where that data it's appropriate for it to live? From a user perspective, from a security perspective, we need to know who everyone is. And so we touched on this earlier, right? The free pro and the PPU licenses, with two exceptions. So the two exceptions where we can publish content and we don't need to know who the user is, so there's kind of no security, so to speak, is publish to web And if we're using Power BI embedded when the application is managing authentication. App owns data, I think, is the lingo for that. So those are our considerations for sure. Azure Active Directory conditional access is actually a really important thing that does a number of cool things for us. So if we talk about kind of first what it is, we set up this idea of conditions. So I have a certain type of user, a certain group, someone's logging in on a certain kind of device, you know, that sort of thing. And then I can say, based on that condition, I want to block access. So for instance, you know, a device that isn't domain joined, for instance, right? Or I can say I'm going to grant access, but if something like, you know, multi-factor authentication is done, or maybe, for instance, and this is something that some people do, I only want to allow a login to the Power BI service if the user is in a certain Active Directory group. That can be done. You know, less common these days, right, is blocking by IP address ranges, right, because people work everywhere these days. So this is less common, but certainly possible. So conditional access is all about saying, you know, what's the condition, and then do we block or grant based on something. And then taking that a few steps further, there is a few features of Azure AD that are also really interesting when we start to use them with Power BI. One of them is terms of use. So for instance, before you grant somebody initial access to the Power BI service, for instance, maybe you want to have them consent to terms of use, right? And this could be data privacy policy. It could be just a Power BI service terms of use policy. It could be data handling policies, right? It could be anything like this that you want to get a confirmed agreement before you allow them to access. We can do access reviews, and there was a question earlier that this came to mind. So let's say you want to do some reviews twice a year, for instance, of who's in your groups. There's this access review feature of Azure AD that kind of helps you do that. And the whole goal is, let's find issues before the auditors do. So for instance, the big things that you definitely want to look at is who are in my admins, right? Who's in my admin group? Let's look at that, you know, quarterly, twice a year, whatever makes sense, that kind of thing. And then we discussed this briefly earlier, but privileged identity management, that's our good way of reducing having too many admins that just have full-time access all the time. So Azure AD gives us all kinds of cool stuff. Now, Power BI is a self-service platform, right? So our content owners, or our content authors, creators, whatever you want to call them, they actually end up managing a whole lot of security directly themselves. So that means from an admin perspective, certainly we want to hopefully influence training that people are getting trained on for what they do for security practices, but we're probably also going to be involved in the auditing side of it. But permissions that are managed by content owners, there's a whole bunch of them, right? We've got the 4 workspace roles. We've got, for content like dashboards and reports, there's a read permission, which can also turn around and be a sharing permission. Or I should say, let me rephrase that. When you do a sharing operation, you're granting a read, right? You can also grant a reshare operation. So if I share a report with Joe, Joe can turn around and reshare it to somebody else as well if I allow it. And that's set by default, by the way. So the control freak in me doesn't necessarily love that, but that's there. Data sets, there is the read permission in a data set. There is the build permission, which is wildly important. And I think maybe not enough people understand how to use it really effectively. The same kind of reshare, there's a data owner that's a property of the data set as well. So all things that the owners would manage. Apps themselves have a read permission to them, and there's also a copy reports permission. So basically kind of the equivalent of, are you allowed to do a save as? Subscriptions, when you're creating a subscription to a report, so let's say I want to have this report emailed to me, twice a week, that kind of thing. You can turn around during it and implicitly grant a read on the underlying item, like the underlying report. There's also the actual recipients of the subscription, right? So I think of that indirectly as security because, they're seeing data. We have data flows. There is a one data flow owner, and those of you that do data flows development probably have experienced the pain of only the data flow owner can make a change, and otherwise you're playing that game of taking over ownership or setting up a service account to be the owner. Power BI Desktop itself, that's where we would set up the row level security. And here's the thing, although we configure row level security inside of Power BI Desktop, it's not actually invoked until the content is published to the Power BI service and is being consumed by somebody who doesn't have edit privileges. So you got to have only viewer permissions for row level security to even work. So if you're an editor, it kind of just skips it, right? And then there's different data source settings that have some permissions and privacy implications as well. We have the file locations that we talked about earlier, right? And then there's some credentials associated with the personal gateway. And certainly there's credentials associated with the standard or enterprise gateway as well. But I mentioned only the personal gateway here since the focus is on, our content authors and what they're managing. So here's another link to a blog post and a video where it's actually a two-part series that talks a little bit more about all these pieces. But there's a whole lot going on in a self-service platform like this. Now, the gateway admin, we already touched on this, right? We've got the administrators that are set at the gateway level. For every individual data source, unless it's single sign-on, we are going to have stored credentials. And so that can sometimes be something that requires some planning, right? If you need to have different credentials used for different people in different places of the org, right? One ID and password might not work for everybody across the org. You've got the user permissions, right? So those users that we just reviewed a couple of minutes ago. And then you've got data privacy levels, right? So same idea that we would set up the privacy inside of desktop. It's not adopted by the data set when you publish it, so you do need to set that at the data source. So if you're not familiar with privacy levels in brief, let's say you've got a public data source and an organizational data source, right? You set those privacy levels of public, private, and organizational. So if when it's doing some performance improvements like query folding, and if it wants to send, say, a set of results from, say, a where statement from one to another, that kind of thing, right? Is it allowed to cross those privacy levels that are set? So it's it can be very important. And Chris Webb has written a lot of stuff about that over the years. Then we've got one of my favorite new features that ends up having an impact on permissions and security in some respects, but it's this idea of sensitivity labels. And so here I'm showing a set of different reports and dashboards, and some of them are set to internal use, some of them are set to highly confidential, some of them are set to restricted, right? So they're all, sales analytics types of reports, but the confidential nature of the data is different. And so this is where it's its own subject of its own, because we can start doing a lot of really interesting things with sensitivity labels in terms of implementing data loss prevention policies and stuff like that. But what you want to have for your sensitivity labels is after you have defined them, and they're done in Microsoft 365, by the way, outside of Power BI, they apply to the whole organization. So it's definitely one of those things where several IT teams, need to get involved, all that kind of stuff. What you need to have is a policy of what does it mean if it's internal use? What can you not do? What can you not do if it's highly confidential, right? All that kind of stuff. In the admin portal, there is a protection metrics report where you can kind of see a little bit more about what the sensitivity labels are being used. Really, it's going to take you over to Cloud App Security to do a little bit more with that. So that handling policy that you want to have for each label, for instance, you might say if it's highly confidential internal only, right, you are not allowed to share that artifact at all with any guest users. You might not be allowed to download it to your local PC if it's at that most highly confidential level. And things like markings, these don't take effect in Power BI content, but they do take effect in Word documents, that kind of stuff. You might say, if it's set at the highly confidential level, you're not allowed to have customer name, customer number, etc. You've got to anonymize the data. Things like that are what I mean by a data handling policy that goes with each label. And then in Cloud App Security, we can do some really interesting stuff. So you can set policies to do some things. And then there are also some built-in policies. These two are actually AI driven. And so what it's doing is it's saying you have a whole lot more either report sharing, I guess they're both report sharing, a lot more of that's happening than is normal for your tenant. Something unusual is happening, you should know about this. So you can configure some things yourself, or use these AI ones that are built in. You can also do some really cool stuff with what they call session controls. So for instance, let's say the scenario that you want to do is if it's got a highly confidential sensitivity label, you want to block the download of the PBIX from the Power BI service completely. And so the pieces of the puzzle of this for you are in Azure Active Directory, you set this thing called a conditional access app control. You connect it up to the Power BI service, and then you have a policy up in Cloud App Security. So multiple pieces to the puzzle. There's lots of documentation out there on this on the Power BI site, and of course for Azure Active Directory stuff. But this is really, really powerful. Love it, love it, love it. And the last thing that I'll mention in our dipping our toes into the side of security and data protection, the administrator needs to manage the security encryption keys. So we've got a number of them, right? The gateway has its own recovery key and such. The Power BI Premium has an encryption key if you're using bring your own key. If you have large models enabled, Premium Storage has an encryption key. Power BI Report Server has an encryption key. So in an ideal world, right, you're using some sort of corporate password manager, even the enterprise level of LastPass or, whatever one of those services you like is great for this kind of stuff, right? It's secure. The next admin can find it if they need it. It's not sitting in plain text in a text file on your machine or a server, all that kind of good stuff. All right, so that was a very, very fast whirlwind things to think about with security. So I almost am scared to ask what questions you might have.
So far, we have no questions. So folks feel...
Oh, we're wearing you down. That's good. No, I'm kidding.
If you have any question here, folks, just drop at the live chat area, and and we will follow up on it later. It's all you.
Sounds good. Well, here's the last piece, the last critical piece to what does an admin do? And you might actually have somebody that's considered a Power BI admin, but they really focus on this side of things a whole lot. So let's talk about usage monitoring first. And I think this is one of the most important things that somebody needs to take care of. So the first piece is, finding what content is used the most. And so, for instance, what if your data refresh isn't as reliable as it should be? Or what if a report shared from my workspace is suddenly getting hundreds of views per day, right? Both those things are a problem. And those are things that you can find out from your usage monitoring if you're not only capturing the data, but you are, timely looking at it and analyzing it and choosing to act on it. Change tracking. So in addition to your content changes, I want to know about security changes. What's happening over time? Internal and external auditors. So for compliance, your audits, your security investigations, that kind of stuff, this data is absolute gold. I'm going to talk in a little bit in a minute about what you want to do to make sure that auditors can actually rely on this data. So we want it to be in an immutable location that cannot be changed, that kind of stuff. So we'll talk about that. But for this, what we really want to have is not only the activity log, but we want to have some snapshots of data at certain points of time as well. For instance, weekly snapshots of what your workspace security looks like is a perfect use case and very, very valuable data. Adoption. Usage is a big part of adoption, but it's not the only part. And think about it this way. More usage stats is not always positive. If you see more downloads, if you see more and more data models that, let's say one user's producing tons of data models, that's more usage, but is it a good thing? Nope. And even more reports rather than designing flexible or more smarter reports. So adoption of a digital tool is about using the technology in the way it was intended to be used or in an optimal way, not just usage. And of course, that's way harder to track, of course. Trustworthiness levels. Are we seeing things like data set certification and data set reuse? Very big deal in making, self-service BI work effectively. Licenses. Do we have pro licenses that aren't being used? Do we have pro users that could just be a free user sitting in premium instead? Or how about finding users who have signed up for a trial, don't yet have a pro license assigned? They're going to have a service interruption here soon because, something hasn't been taken care of that should be. How about understanding our usage patterns? Do we have too many exports happening? Do we have just a way ton too many subscriptions happening, right? I'm not saying subscriptions are bad, but maybe they're just being way overused. Or just really finding things where we have unmet needs or refactoring that could help. Training opportunities. What if you see somebody doing a ton of sharing from my workspace? So you say, I'm going to send them a nice message, giving them some information about why workspaces and apps are a better solution in certain situations. Or what if you see a ton of data sets that are duplicative, right? What if you see the first time a newly licensed user viewed or published some content? So you direct them to some internal training or documentation, right? They should have already had it, but all these things you could use. What if you see a user who does just a ton of Excel exports? So you direct them to some information on how to use Analyze in Excel instead, right? All that kind of stuff without being creepy, of course. And then suspicious usage patterns, right? Just weird things that are just anomalies. We've got AI, a couple of examples for that, but in a lot of cases, we'll have to kind of try to find those ourselves as well. Where most people start is they start to get the Power BI activity events, and you get something like your workspace inventory, right? A list of your reports, dashboards, data sets, etc. You get those from the REST APIs, and you bring that into Power BI, and you do some nice reports. This has a variety of limitations, right? You don't have historical data, and this is not a solution you can necessarily rely on for formal auditing and compliance purposes. So while that might be a good place to start and learn and do a proof of concept and figure out what you need, what we want to evolve to is something like this. And usually this is done through, a series of PowerShell scripts. And then first, we've got our activity events. Second, we've got a variety of things. We can get a ton of stuff from the REST APIs, right? We add that. Then we go after the graphed REST APIs, right? So we talked about group memberships, role memberships, things like that we talked about earlier. Who's got what licenses, user information. And this all by itself is really important because out of things like the activity events and such, I only have an email address, right? If I go and I get more user information, I can get things like what department do they work in, right? What's their location? All those things Azure Active Directory hopefully might be storing. Finally, we've got gateway logs. Those are kind of our last priority usually, but those can absolutely be married in as well. So what we want to do is we want to bring all this data in the raw data. Bring them in as JSON files. I don't care where you stick them, really. It could be a data lake, can be a file system. I don't care where. What I want them to be, though, is the raw data. So lots and lots of people on blogs, especially when they're pulling activity events and that kind of stuff, they select the data elements they want right from the very beginning. And that's a bad idea because you're leaving stuff, right? You don't know what you're missing and you can't go back indefinitely and get it, right? So just get all the raw data, dump it somewhere, preferably an immutable location. And what we mean by that is once the file is written, it cannot be deleted and it cannot be changed. That's how an auditor can then rely on that data. Now, you may choose to say, you may choose to create like an auditing database, right? Old habits die hard. I still kind of like it, right? Because that's my background. Could you also build some of your curated data in your data lake? Absolutely. Or could you possibly just take it straight to Power BI without the database in the middle? Certainly, right? Kind of just depends on where you want to take things and what your requirements really are. So what you end up with then is down here, the thing that the auditors can rely on, like we talked about. And then once you've got this beautiful set of reports that has really enhanced what your users can get to, there's no question that you can let them see this set of reports, secure it with row level security if you need to. And it gives them so much more than they get from those little report level, usage reports that Power BI creates on its own. There's a whole bunch of different ways that we can go after getting the monitoring data. We're not going to review all of these. What I strongly suggest is that you go after the newest PowerShell module called Get Power BI Activity Event. There is an old PowerShell module if you're still using it, or if you run into it in a blog, because there's some older blog entries that have been around so long, right, that they got good Google juice. So they still show up at the top, and I just cringe. Don't use that guy. Use the new one. You might also use the Microsoft 365 Management API, especially if you also want to go after, Exchange data, Teams data, SharePoint data, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so know what your normal is, right? And this means you got to do analytics on this data. So it's step 1 is to start capturing it. Step 2 is to really actually use it so that you understand when you can take action and improve the state of your implementation, right? Accumulate the history, keep, especially the activity log, but even some of your snapshots, like your security snapshots, I would say keep them as long as you can. Securely retain those raw data files. We already talked about this, right? Not only the formal auditing, but you can always go back and reparse that raw data if you have it. So if you did create like a database and you're parsing the data into nice columns and rows, and you're like, oh no, something new came in last month and I didn't know. Okay, add it to your database, you know, reload, reparse, not a real big deal. And then start correlating it with the other data. That's the whole top row that we just looked at on the chart, right? Bringing in Microsoft Graph, et cetera, et cetera. There's two main ways, right, that we get after the data. We've got these PowerShell modules, and then we've got REST APIs. Knowing that, PowerShell can also call the REST APIs if you choose to. So in this session, and especially because we're running so woefully late, this is very good. I've got a whole nother session on kind of getting started with the activity log and the REST APIs. But in a nutshell, right, with this thing called the management module, there's a whole lot of things that you can do, right? Like getting your activity log data, lots of ways that you can get information. We can also actively manage the Power BI service. We can do things like create workspaces. We can do things like refresh data sets if we want to do so outside of the service. The data gateway module is separate, and I talk about in that other session that I linked to some really key differences, especially from the PowerShell side, that I'll just skip for now. The REST APIs, we're not going to dive into this. The thing that I want you to know, though, the REST APIs have more options than the Power BI management module. So you can think of the Power BI management module, so the PowerShell thing, it's kind of a wrapper around the APIs, and it adds another layer of obfuscation, right? So since it's one more step down the track, so to speak, it takes a little bit longer for things to come there. So if you don't find something in the management module, look in the APIs. But the Power BI service, the browser, does way more stuff than the APIs does. So if you're somebody that works in Azure, right, you might be accustomed to Azure. In a lot of cases says, oh, we don't have this in the UI, but you can do it in the API. Power BI takes the opposite mentality. It's a self-service platform first and foremost. So automation like this always is second, not first. So you won't find everything you need from an automation standpoint in the APIs. All right, the last thing I will mention is this thing called the XMLA endpoint. We get it with premium capacity or PPU, and it's basically a protocol that lets us communicate with our data set. And it lets us communicate with our data set via the TOM or the object model. Now, there's two main things that we can do with this XMLA endpoint. One is we have read-write activities. And if you remember, when we looked at that PPU page a few minutes ago, remember how it had that toggle of read-write or just read? This is what we're talking about. If we're going to do read-write, we can do things like using a tool that does stuff that's not natively built into Power BI. And a perfect example of this is calculation groups in Tabular Editor. We can do things like integrating with source control or DevOps, right? Because we can talk to these other tools and then communicate with the data set separately. We can execute a data refresh from other tools or even just manage it in some way, like redeploy it, I mean, right? So that item number one was read write, okay? The other way we use XMLA is just straight up read activities. And we're talking to administrators here, right? So let's talk about things like monitoring, debugging, tracing, right? Your Power BI data set is an analysis services model, which means we have DMVs available to us. We can query them. We can get all sorts of really cool information. We can also file up a SQL profiler trace if we want to on our model, which is an AS instance. We can also, which this isn't necessarily an admin thing, but I couldn't not mention it, because we're just connecting to a data set, right? We could connect through native tools like Management Studio, etc. Or if you've got a third-party tool that somebody doesn't want to part with, if it is XMLA compliant, it can hook up and connect to your data set. So that can actually expand the data reuse that you have within your Power BI tenant beyond the Power BI world itself, which is very cool. Lots more to talk about with the XMLA endpoint. If that kind of stuff interests you, look for presentations on it. Look for presentations on composite model. Well, sort of, kind of. Things like tabular editor, things like ALM toolkit, that kind of thing that can really take advantage of the XMLA endpoint. All right, so since I only have a couple things left, why don't I hold whatever questions we have left for this next piece. So the last thing that I want to review with you is, I just told you a whole bunch of stuff over the last 2.5 hours, right? I have three kind of buckets for you. So if you are just getting started as an administrator overseeing Power BI, like what are the top things I would say do this first? So the very top thing that I would say is, if you're not getting your activity log data, don't worry about parsing it. Don't worry about reports. Just start capturing that raw data so you have the history. That's a very high priority. Validate and document all of your tenant settings if in fact you are uncertain that they are all, where you want them to be. Validate who is a Power BI administrator role, and set it to be the minimum number of people if you can. And if you have your gateway server, if it's currently a single mode and it's a busy gateway that does, a fair bit of data refreshes, direct query, etc., and it would be a real problem if something happened, take care of that and just add another server to the cluster. Power BI makes that pretty easy. It's probably more trouble for you to get, IT to provision another VM by far than it is to add it to the cluster. So those are sort of my top 4 if you're just getting started. Now let's say you're like, yeah, Melissa, I got that. What next? Well, take that activity log data and really start using it, right? Do analytics on it, take action, that kind of thing. Then start augmenting it with other data that makes it far more valuable, like anything in the world of data warehousing. As soon as we start correlating it with other data, it's far more valuable and useful. Take a look at your workspaces, take a look at your apps, take a look at your naming conventions, right? Understand how everything's being used as you've made all of your decision with the tenant settings, right? How does all that line up, and are you happy with it? And do an end-to-end security review. And if you find things you're not really happy with, figure out who to talk to say, well, we need to train people better, or give them better documentation, or do a lunch and learn, or, whatever in the user education area. You're like, yeah, Melissa, I got that. We're good. What's next? So this was sort of, wishy-washy general, but just try to be more proactive with managing the tenant, right? I went through a bunch of scenarios that you could have, especially with, your activity log data, and figure out how to prevent problems before you have them. Work with your governance team or whomever it is on improving trustworthiness, consistency, shared data sets and certified data sets. Although we didn't talk about that from an administrator perspective, if you're really in the trenches with administration, you're certainly, got a vested interest in that. Sensitivity labels and your data handling policies, definitely, start the ball rolling there. It might take a while to get that all through the approval chain because your sensitivity labels do apply to the entire organization. And then think about efficiency and automation, right? Not only with things like PowerShell, but maybe with the XMLA endpoint, maybe things like improving how you do your deployments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the release plan, you want to keep a close eye on that. New stuff sneaks in all the time. You need to watch for what's coming because you will have extra work for you when things come along. A perfect example is the new workspace experience, right? The old Office 365 groups that are migrating to the new workspace experience. How about organizational content packs that have gotten deprecated over time, and we use apps now? Even the premium evolution of Gen 2, right? Keep an eye on it. You got to follow the Power BI blog closely. They follow a lot of really, really important information that you have to have. And then generally speaking, we have a wonderful, vibrant community, gobs of people doing presentations, blogs, videos, but information gets out of date really fast. So just be careful. Last thoughts, and then we're going to wrap it up, right? Don't necessarily make your administration decisions on the fly, right? Tie it in with, even if you don't necessarily have a governance board or team, right? Tie it in with what are your goals and your guiding principles for governing and managing and overseeing the platform. And your role as an administrator, I know I'm getting a little preachy here, right? But your role is not to say no, right? It's always the DBAs say, my job is to say no, right? Your role is to help people get things done within the requisite guidelines, right? Try to be proactive, try to get yourself to where you're, being repeatable and automating things and that kind of stuff. And then because features change so fast and all the time, it's not a bad thing to say, I need to do a technical proof of concept to prove that out and make sure it does what you expect it to do because, we can't expect. So make that a habit if that's not something that's just what you always do. And a POC doesn't always have to be throwaway work, right? It can just be simple. Maybe it's thrown away. And maybe it grows up to be something else later. So before we open it up to the last Q&A, I will just point out, here's where you can find more stuff from me. On the presentations page is not only this presentation, there's like 4 or 5 other ones that you might like if you like this, right? The governance training that we talked about at the very beginning, the link to that is at the bottom left here, and a variety of other things. I threw in a few suggested resources as well. There's a new book that came out just very recently. I admit I'm only about 20% through it so far, but I would say if you are in this world, this is a new book, timely, so go for it. And then finally, I haven't had a chance to watch these yet, but just last month, they had a full 8 hours of administrator in a day training that the Power BI product team put on with a handful of different people from the community. I think they kind of just went in and out on topics. I haven't had a chance to catch up on it yet, but enough people were involved. I'm sure there's lots and lots of good info, and I wanted to make sure that you had these links as well. And with that, deep breath. Let's do the final Q&A with anybody who has been strong enough to make it to the end of our marathon presentation.
All right, folks. And Melissa, so folks, remember, use the live chat. I'm going to switch you to the camera, Melissa, in just a minute. Folks, remember to...
You just got me doing a drink and then it made me cough.
No, I haven't changed it yet. You still have a minute.
Yeah, I know you can see me over on the team side. So hang on, I'm getting myself together here.
All right, let me know. All right, folks. As you heard, take a minute, enter your questions in the live chat. If you're watching live, if you are viewing this session after the event, you can use the comment section under the video to enter. Also, those who are watching right now and those who will watch, drop a comment. Let us know how you like the video. What were the key factors that you enjoyed the most, or sorry, which key points in the presentation you enjoyed the most. And I will also add the more information right now that is displaying right now on the screen to the description of the video. So if you're out there watching, you can just click, and many times you have to click on the, I believe it's called show more, and you see those links there on the section that talks about Melissa. All right, so include the slides, diagrams, blog, YouTube video, Twitter, and the Power BI governance training. Great opportunity, as you have experience here, to learn from Melissa. And thank you, Juliet. Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Kevin. And Melissa, let me switch to you here. All right, and 2 seconds. All right, Melissa. Thank you. I would like to take the opportunity, in addition to all the members and viewers that are here thanking you, to thank you as well on behalf of the South Florida Power BI user group, as well as organizers, members, sponsors, and you for taking the time and be here with us.
Sure, thanks for having me. This was fun.
All right,
and thanks for all the questions y'all had, especially early. That was really fun.
Yeah, definitely. I'm quite sure they clarified a lot. I see that everyone definitely were able to derive and increase their knowledge from the presentation, whether it's those right now and those that will come in the future as just viewer of the YouTube video. And I do not see any more questions.
All right, we beat everybody down enough. So, well, thanks for joining, everyone. It was a pleasure, and thank you for having me, Adriano.
Hey, thank you.